Have you guys ever wondered what are the best Bloodline modes in the entirety of Shindo Life? We'll look no further in this video about to find out. So if you guys enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe, and subscribe to the video, guys. By the way, we're going to be doing this Bloodline tier list a little bit differently. I'm going to be ranking them based on tiers instead of, worst to best. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Let me know in the comments if you like this format more. All right, so starting off with the terrible tier. Now, this is the tier that I consider the modes to be either completely unusable or so hard to use or just so rare that they're actually good to be to the point where you should just stay away from these modes if at all possible. Of course, starting this off with the train, I'm going to be starting with Jokai Air Hockey Jokai. These modes really bring nothing to the table other than that they used to have a glitch where you could infinitely stack the C-Spec and one-shot someone. That is literally all this mode ever had, and as it stands right now, it is by far one of the worst modes in the entire game due to just the absolute terrible abilities that are super predictable and the fact that the only thing it has going for is that it drains a little bit of chi from people. Now, next up is going to be Minakami. Now, something to say about Minakami is that you actually need to have the bloodline equipped, so you can't just equip it and then use it. So the whole loadout thing doesn't work properly with Minakami. I just want to put that out there. But with the actual mode, it's going to be here simply because the mode doesn't really bring anything special to the table other than the weapon spec being a beam that you can combo extend with. Glacier's here for very obvious reasons. The C-Spec is by far one of the worst C-Specs in the game. Okami's going to be here. It's pretty obvious why. The whole dash ability is really not that great. If you want that, just use a better ability with it. Station's obviously going to be here because the C-Spec literally has so much end lag that you won't be able to use it. It has an end lag longer than the reaction timing of a 90-year-old. Giovanni Shizen, after they nerfed the actual C-Spec damage of this mode, it is literally one of the worst modes in the entire game. Ghost Karashi, it's super range locked, and overall, it's just like the mode drain is not worth it. Kamaki, obviously, after they nerfed the C-Spec damage, this is by far one of the worst damage modes in the game. Paper is kind of like the same thing as Kamaki. The Paper Z-Spec, if you actually manage to land it on someone, you'll be surprised to find out it does barely any damage. Bubble, the C-Spec is super predictable, and the M1's knocked back way too far. Alright, so the next tier of the actual Bloodline modes is going to be the below average. Now, these are going to be the modes that are only going to be usable in very specific situations, but they aren't the worst in the game. Now, starting this off with Dokai, obviously the C-Spec does have the silence attached to it, but overall the buffed M1s are the only other thing that people like from it. Tengoku is a very damage-oriented mode, but the C-Spec is extremely hard to hit on someone that's moving, and the weapon spec is also extremely hard to hit on someone that's moving. Though the throwable is good, it is a very small part of the actual mode, and the M1s are just, pretty basic. Riser Kuma, obviously, this is just a worse version of Bankai Kuma's mode. If you manage to land the C-Spec, good for you. Bankai Inferno's mode is renowned to be one of the, one of the bad rare modes of the game. The Z-Spec is extremely hard to hit, the throwable is borderline useless, and the weapon spec is just a buffed Ember Blade. Satori Ren, this mode is overall really not that great. Now, I do commend the fact that it can do a lot of damage, but the chance of you doing that damage is very, it's not gonna happen. Kakatsu is mainly meant for M1 combos with the weapon spec. Senko has a Z-Spec that actually does dash to teleport to someone, but has no stun attached to it, so you have to be very, gimmicky with it. Kaijin, the Z-Spec is good for PvE content, but that's about it. Azarashi is good for M1 combos. The first one, leaps to someone, the second one pulls them in. Karada has that gigantic damage burst, but overall it's really not, that useful in a lot of different scenarios. Conchu does actually have the chi drain attached to the M1s. It no longer knocks back, so it actually is usable somewhat. Dangan mode, it's very, difficult to use, but if you can use it properly, it can actually do quite well. Mecha Spirit, since the Z2 mode had its chi drain reduced, this isn't going to be in the terrible tier, but it's still pretty bad. Jiramaki, obviously, the fact that the M1s knock them super far back really isn't that great overall, and it makes the mode almost borderline unusable. Eastwood Karashi, the only thing it has going for it is honestly the throwable. Other than that, the actual abilities are quite bad. Alfirama Shizen, if the mode drained less, this would be a usable mode, but right now it's very niche to being a PvE only mode just because it drains an absolute ton of mode to use it. Vine is mainly meant for trolling because you can go underneath the ground and hunt people down. Sand is pretty bad mode overall. It used to do a lot of damage on the Z-Spec, but that was nerfed for some reason. Also, the mode actually has no tie stats. Storm, the C-Spec is very hard to hit on someone that's actually trying to fight back against you, and the actual stats are terrible. Calais, now this one is mainly meant for traveling, but if you're not traveling with it, it'll be a very useless ability. Ink overall is okay. I do think the weapon spec isn't the worst in the world, but there's definitely a lot better now. Now, the next tier on this list is going to be the average tier. Now, these Bloodline modes are going to be okay, but not the best in the game.
Have you ever gotten 80th spin rarity and gotten something like just atomic? Well, that's because you haven't hit the like button on this video yet. If you hit the like button on this video, you're guaranteed to get 10 million times luck. 100%.
Bankai Kuma obviously does have the C-Spec that's exactly like Riser's, but it does also have a weapon spec that dashes to someone. Overall, if you can hit the C-Spec, good for you. Shiver Kuma, this mode actually is pretty good for, stalling out fights or just getting a quick stun on someone, but generally people only use this for either escaping fights or getting around the map. Son Goku does obviously have that third mode, which actually can be useful if you know how to use it properly, but a lot of the time this mode will be borderline borderline useless compared to the other modes in the game. Ryan Rengoku, obviously the Z2 mode actually had its timer removed completely, but the stats was lowered. But overall, this mode is still usable somewhat. It just isn't as good as it was before, you know, in general. Diva Ren, this is one of the newest modes to the game. The actual Diva Ren mode, the counter is pretty bad, and the weapon spec is extremely close range, so it's mainly meant for just extending M1 combos. Forge Ren, the mode does a lot of damage, but half the time, it's not even going to work out for you. Sriracha Akuma, this mode actually has the C4 part of the mode. Now, this part of the mode actually can be quite good, but you will actually drain a ton of mode, just like all the true Samurai Spirits do. Doku Tengoku, this mode isn't the worst in the game. Actually, they actually buffed the M1 so they no longer knock back, but even though it was buffed, it still isn't the greatest in the game, just because the actual abilities are hard to, you know, use properly. Shadow, the C-Spec does a lot of damage against bosses, but in PvP content, it's pretty bad. Raikishizen and Shizen, the C-Spec does a lot of damage, so this is really good for PvE content, but the chance of you actually hitting this with someone in a PvP fight is very, very low. Wanzayame, obviously the Z-Spec is good for draining chi from people, so you could do M1 combo, they'll lose all their chi, but it's very hard to set this up. Eternal, the C-Spec is actually quite good because it does a lot of damage now, but the chances of you actually using this in a fight are very low, which is the reason why people just generally don't. Azim Seko, the C-Spec actually can be used for extending combos and stuff like that. It actually is a pretty good stun and a good damage ability, but it's kind of hard to set up sometimes. Sabru, obviously the C-Spec does bypass block, but the range is pretty limited. With Hair, the C-Spec actually can be used for, you know, combo extending or just combos in general, but the mode itself really isn't that great when you factor in the stats and the knockback M1. Odin Sabru is the exact same thing as Sabru, except the C-Spec also stuns. Pikaseko, this mode is actually good for iframing, but other than iframing, generally you won't be using it that much. You also can't have a weapon while you're using it. Minakaze generally it's like the pure definition of an average mode. It's a time stop, but it's easily, you know, avoidable or counterable. Ryuji Kenichi, ever since the Z-Spec was actually nerfed, so the actual low life mode no longer has the auto dodge it has, it still is an average mode because the fact of having a second life is extremely good, but it isn't as good as it used to be. With Vengeance, I do think that if you can land the C-Spec on someone, you could do a quick, you know, 150,000 damage to someone. Other than that, the actual weapon spec of this mode is pretty bad, and the throwable is very hard to use. Bruce Kenichi, the C-Spec actually can moveset at the end of it, and the M1s do a lot of damage with no knockback, but you also need to keep in mind that Bruce Kenichi overall, the mode has terrible stats, and you do need to factor that in. Apollo Sand is really good for PvE content, so the C-Spec does a lot of damage to the bosses, but for PvP, it's pretty lackluster. With Black Shock, the Z-Spec can be used for M1 combo extending, but generally it's not going to be that good in a lot of different scenarios. Ashen Storm, they actually did buff the mode, so the mode is actually a lot better now, hence why it's not in below average or terrible, but the C-Spec is kind of hard to, you know, set up in properly. Nectar can do a lot of damage, but it's generally not really going to be that useful as a Z-Spec because it does actually take a lot of mode to use. Now, Ragnar is going to be the last entry into the average modes list. Now, this is going to be just because Ragnar itself is generally viewed as being one of those modes that it just could be a lot better. The C-Spec doesn't have iframes, you're locked into using it until you actually click, and the Q-Spec is just the worst bruise stomp. Also, the actual, you know, M1s of it, there are more higher damage non-knockback M1s in the game. All right, so the next tier is going to be the above average tier. Now, these are going to be average modes that are just slightly or a lot better than the actual average ones. So if it weren't for the average tier, these ones would be average, but they're slightly better than average, hence the name above average. Ryan Akuma, obviously, he does have the C-Spec that's a mode drain, iframe, big damage ability. Ryan Akuma mode is one of my personal favorites as well, considering that the C-Spec and the weapon spec are both iframe abilities. Red Shiki's another above average one. The C2 mode of it, which is like the ultimate mode of Red Shiki, the M1s do a lot of damage. The C-Spec does a ton of damage. Like, it's one of the highest damage C-Specs in the game, and it place locks them. And overall, it's just a really, really good damage mode. Ryan Guidance is going to be another above average one. The C-Spec is a, you know, it's an okay counter ability. I do not like C-Spec counters, but it's okay for what it is. The weapon spec is a click, you know, on click ability that does a lot of damage if it actually hits, and the throwable is just the Tengoku weapon spec. Kenichi does actually have the C2, which is an auto dodge, and the actual weapon spec is actually good for M1 combo extending. You do have Cobra that does have the reanimation, which is actually an extremely good part of the mode, combined with the fact that the M1s do a lot of poison damage. Shiro Glacier has undoubtedly one of the single best weapon specs in the game. Imagine Strange's weapon spec. That's what Shiro Glacier's weapon spec is. Kagoku, obviously, it's so good as a mode that they actually had to ban it competitive. If you actually manage to be able to use the dimensions of the actual mode, it can be one of the most, you know, stomp modes in the entire game. Van Helsing has so much iframes, it has to be considered as an above average one. If you know how to properly use these iframes, you will absolutely stomp on people. Now, the next tier is going to be the amazing tier. Now, these are going to be the ones that are big, giant standouts from the rest. Now, they're not going to be as good as the unstoppable tier, which is the next one, but they are amazing, hence the name amazing. Satori Kuma has that weapon spec as the block break. It does 80,000 damage combined with the C spec that allows you to either get away from your enemy or get close to them. Or it could actually confuse them into you being knocked down, depending on if they know what Satori mode actually is. Combined with the fact that the actual M1s no longer knock back, this definitely is a really amazing mode. Shindai Kuma, obviously the C-Spec is a counter combined with the fact that it can summon clones. You could also make them true Samurai Spirit clones if you're in the final mode of Shindai Kuma. Combined with the fact that the actual weapon spec of C3 is extremely good because it is a mode drain ability that is an iframe. It also does a lot of damage, has a very low cooldown attached to it. It also has the added benefit of the M1s no longer knocking them back. Light Jokai, obviously the C-Spec is extremely good against people, but if they actually block it, it no longer bypasses block, which is a huge downside now. But overall, it can be used if they know how to actually use Light Jokai mode. Combined with the fact that M1s do drain a lot of chi and the weapon spec isn't the worst in the world. Xeno Dokai, obviously this is going to be here because it's a single best PvE mode in the entire game. It drains a ton of damage from bosses, but it doesn't do much damage to players. Shindai Ren, obviously this is one of the best modes of the game due to the absolute fat M1 range of the actual second mode of this. The M1 range, I'm pretty sure it's the biggest M1 range in the game, and the throwable is extremely good. Naramaki, obviously since the C2 was actually buffed, it actually has one of the highest stats in the game for a C2 mode, combined with the fact that it actually has extremely good high damage abilities that, if you know how to use properly, can extend your combos. Also, the M1s do chi drain for the people that actually like that sort of thing. Boramaki obviously has the C3 mode, which actually does a ton of damage, has really good block breaks, and the M1s do a lot of damage as well. Now, last but not least in the amazing tier is going to be the 6-path Naramaki Bloodline. Now, I was thinking about putting this into the unstoppable tier, but for a few reasons I won't. Just because the moves are super predictable, but if you can manage to land these moves on someone, they will take a ton of damage. So if you know how to integrate these into your combos, it will just end up being pretty much a lot of free damage. Combined with the fact that the M1s do drain chi and actually does have a really high stat pool, this is definitely a very amazing Bloodline mode. Now, last but not least in the entire Bloodline mode tier, this is going to be the unstoppable Bloodlines. All of the modes on this list are going to be very, very good for what they are, and I will be listing the strengths and downsides of each, combined with the fact that I do actually want to list out why they're just so broken. So I will be taking a little bit more time on these than the rest. By the way, guys, what is your favorite Bloodline Shindo Life? Leave your comments below. We'll be checking them out. Obviously, with Strange, we're going to be starting this out. Strange is going to be the current best Bloodline within the entire game. The C-Spec is a time stop combined with the fact that it actually is a pseudo, auto dodge ability, because you do heal back all of the damage you take during the C-Spec. I would also like to say the M1s are one of the highest damage M1s in the game, and they do not knock back at all, and they are actually quite far range. Now, this is, this sounds really good, but when you factor in the fact that it actually can fly, combined with the fact that it actually has a weapon spec which rivals Shiro Glacier as being one of the best weapon specs in the game. It is an AoE ability that hits everyone inside of it, does tons of damage to them. It's a hit stun, combined with the fact that it is an iframe. Absolutely amazing weapon spec that is a true combo extender and does tons of damage. Strange is by far the best Bloodline in the game. I mean, in general, and the mode is the best as well. Rengoku is going to be in here, obviously, as being the most versatile mode of the game. It has everything you would ever need from a Bloodline mode. So, imagine like 6 Bloodline abilities thrown into a single mode, combined with the fact that you get free companion with it. And, there's certain game modes where you can't use companions, like Arena X and Competitive. Well, now you got companions, buddy. Combined with the fact that it actually is a 6th companion, so you could switch your, switch your C-Spec, and then you are able to get another companion out. The weapon spec isn't the best in the world. It's just a counter ability that allows you to extend off of it, but I do actually think Rengoku mode, being the most versatile mode of the game, definitely deserves to be in this list. Next up is going to be Dio Senko as the best combo starting mode in the entire game. First of all, C1 mode actually is extremely good for starting combos from a very long range. I'm pretty sure it's one of the longest range C-Specs in the game. If you actually aim your cursor over them and hit them from extremely far distance away, you could start any combo. It is one of the, I'm pretty sure it is the best dueling mode besides Strange, and it is one of the best just modes for starting out 1v1s. But please be aware of that. If you want a team fight, the C2 mode is better overall because it can hit multiple people, and overall the C2 mode has more AoE to it. But last but not least, in the unstoppable tier, coming out with an absolute upset of a Bloodline mode tier list, Rune Khonshu. Rune Khonshu is not the best Bloodline mode in the game, but it is definitely top 5. People sleep on this Bloodline mode so hard. I just want to say this, the Rune Khonshu abilities are terrible, but this mode redeems this Bloodline like no other in the entire game. Rune Khonshu mode is seriously good, and I want you guys to understand that, just because I feel like after this video, I want to see more Rune Khonshu mode users, because it is good, and I feel like it's definitely underappreciated. The C-Spec is actually one of the worst ones of it, funnily enough, because it's usually the best. The C-Spec is a delayed ability that could do up to like 70,000-80,000 damage to someone. You could throw it into a combo just for free damage. It's just, it's easy to do after a stun, so it's just like, it ends up being a free 80k damage that actually does drain a bit of chi. Now, the best abilities are going to be the throwable and weapon spec. Weapon spec is super easy to integrate into every single combo, does like 40-50,000 damage instantly, and actually is good for draining chi. Now, the throwable ability is actually true extender, so you can M1 combo into the throwable, and actually does last the round for a very long time. So it actually can disrupt their abilities, and after they perfect block, you could actually get free damage from this throwable. They're forced to keep blocking, which actually is hilarious, considering you could charge your chi while the throwable is ongoing. Also, the M1s are buffed and do more damage and do steal chi, so this mode is actually really good, and the stats aren't even that bad of it. Anyways, guys, that's for this video. If you guys enjoyed this video, remember to like, subscribe. Hopefully see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.